Thank you. Sorry to drag you back from your much-needed refreshments. Thank you. I'd like to introduce to the stage a member of the Foundation Board, Marie Edwards, who will introduce our first keynote.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed that morning tea. It was very delicious. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. My name is Marie Edwards. I'm the member for Bendigo West. I'm the Deputy Speaker of the Victorian Parliament and I am the Victorian Government elected representative of the Foundation Board. A position that I've held, I think, now for about 6 years and have been elected to twice. So you can see that I am indeed quite passionate about the Foundation and the work that the Foundation does. And of course, we have very wonderful leadership at our Foundation now, and we also have fabulous employees who do an amazing job. To my fellow board members, to our chair, Julie Leggetti, to our CEO, Louise Glenville, and to the many guests here today, can I begin by acknowledging our sister organisation in New Zealand, who is represented here today by Richard Northey, the chair of their board, and Paula Snowden, who is the CEO, as well as some board members. It's a great privilege to have representatives from New Zealand here today. It just shows how important this conference is, and the work that we do both here and in New Zealand is so important, and it's making a big difference to people's lives. My job today is to acknowledge and indeed introduce our Deputy Chair of the Board, Belinda Duarte. Belinda is going to kick off today's conference information session around Aboriginal people and Indigenous outcomes, which I think is a wonderful way to start off the conference. And Belinda is very well placed to be our first speaker today. Born and raised in Ballarat, and for those of you who don't know where Ballarat is, it's south of Bendigo and much colder. Belinda is a Wotjobaluk and Celtic Polish heritage. She is Chief Executive Officer at Culture is Life, a not-for-profit organisation committed to cultural strengthening for the prevention of Aboriginal youth suicide. She was the inaugural director of the Corinne Gamajil Institute based at Richmond Football Club, where she was responsible for delivering leadership and pathway programs for young Aboriginal Australians. Belinda holds a range of appointed and voluntary positions, including Deputy Chair of the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation, Co-Chair of Reconciliation Victoria, member of the Victorian Premier's Jobs and Investment Panel, Director of the Wheeler Centre, Board Member of Waste Aid, Director of the Anna Miller Foundation, and member of the Victorian Regional Churchill Fellowship Committee. So she is a very, very busy woman. Can I just, before I hand over to Belinda, say that I am very proud to be a member of the Victorian Government that is working towards the first ever treaty with our Indigenous Victorians. So over to you, Belinda. Thank you. She's going. Good one.
Sorry, there's no grace in that at all.
I'm taking the stairs.
I didn't know that there were stairs on the other side. I'm like, gee, if I had heels, I'd be in so much trouble. Oh, clearly I roll very casually. So though it might be a keynote speech, I'm going to take it as I do. So thank you, Marie, for that beautiful introduction. And I don't know whether anybody else goes through it, but you have a kind of personal cringe factor when you're being introduced, don't you? But I will, I guess, commence by just exhaling and acknowledging country and paying my respect to the Wadwurrung people, elders past and present. I wasn't able to be here for the welcome, but I'm sure it would have been generous, anchoring, and a really critical reminder of place and where we reside around this bay. And for me, I want to thank them, and particularly our elders, for their resilience, defiance and their gorgeous humour that brings us to life. And I haven't had the chance to touch Kevin on the shoulder, but I can't believe we got Kevin here. My God. Do you realise how rock star-ish Kevin is to the Aboriginal community when it comes to not only giving voice to some of the most confronting issues for us as Aboriginal people, but doing it through our humour and in a way in which engages people. So humour has been something that has allowed us to cope on a whole range of levels, and it's one of the most admirable qualities of the oldest living and very humble culture or cultures of the world. I am reminded when I'm feeling a bit sad and sorry for myself, when I look at our elders in our community, of their resilience, their courage, and how stoic they have been, and it makes me be able to step up and continue to do things that maybe I find a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit confronting, but it is a reminder for me to continue to work in honour and respect of their leadership and for those who have gone before us. Wadawurrung country is a special place for me. It's my birthplace. I want to thank the ancestors and community members that have adopted the Wadawurrung country in a way in which has taken care of me and my family over the years. For we have lived off country, away from Wotjobaluk, northwest Victoria, but forever connected spiritually to our homelands, with also connections to Djadjurrung country. It's culturally significant birthplace. And for those of you who are here, for the Aboriginal people in the audience, I feel often, I totally want to hear more from other Aboriginal people, and I'm very mindful that to talk from one perspective is just my perspective, and that's not our way culturally. So I'm going to break the rules a little bit and give us some breathing space to have questions within the audience, which means that I mightn't field the question. There might be an Aboriginal person in the audience that would feel more comfortable to do that. I also want to acknowledge our First Nations people here from New Zealand and Canada. I'm really looking forward to the First Nations catch-up and the yarning circles that are occurring later today. I'm taking a breath and I will acknowledge our Minister that was here earlier, to our Chair and fellow board members, staff that have done a deadly job in setting up the conference, and our CEO who has led the charge. To our special guests and obviously you as conference participants. Our place, our belonging, means that we bring with us our ancestral stories. And this plays a critical role in who we are, in our identity, in acknowledging our ancestral stories as Victorians. Finally, I'd also like to acknowledge the lived experiences cohort that are here today and that will be here over the days ahead. For this is the reason why we gather. I ache to think of the harm that has been felt by yourselves and your families at the cost of gambling. We seek to eliminate this and create systems that change and protects all Victorians from the risks associated with that. I need to be clear, I don't have experience myself with gambling harm or with my own Aboriginal immediate family, but have had experience with this in a very close relationship. I've been exposed to the conversations, I've been exposed to the secrecy, the shame, the justifications of what is seen to have no real financial harm to the wellbeing of the individual or the family unit, but without the full context of what health and wellbeing means, then the complete picture of what harm is not clear, and the reality of the cost of it is not truly felt and shared. I've also dealt with some direct experiences with young men who have had significant incomes that have found themselves experiencing gambling harm through learnt behaviours, a lack of education and support, and really managing the challenge of cultural expectations. I've been in a position of care of a young man who was removed with his brother as a small child from his mum. They were in a car after being in dangerously high temperatures while their mother was gambling and managing addiction. This young man has taken extraordinary steps to overcome the pressures, and yet the normalised view of gambling has seen him being regularly taken with his peers and older men to the very environment that caused his removal from his mother in the first place. And I can't imagine the repeat impact of the trauma on that young man in being exposed to that setting again and again. So, why am I passionate about the health and wellbeing and addressing the factors that limit or are symptomatic of the barriers to experiencing a full life which is equitable and, a full sense of wellbeing that is consistent with our fellow Australians, or in this case with our fellow Victorians that are gifted? Because it currently doesn't exist, I don't want this job. I actually don't want to have to talk in front of hundreds of people. I don't want to have to constantly educate and inform. We, Aboriginal people, don't want to be living the disadvantage that we still statistically experience. But I want to be a part of eliminating the behaviours that harm our communities, both from an Aboriginal perspective and a non-Aboriginal perspective. I want to be a part of movements which mobilise change and eliminate the apathy and the acceptance and tolerance that seems to be extraordinarily comfortable place to stay in when we talk too heavily about numbers instead of the deep emotional and spiritual well-being and the impact of that on our communities. Now, as for gambling in Aboriginal communities, don't get me wrong, this is not a speech about Okay. This is not a speech. Don't use that as a gag on me later, right? He will too. It's not about the elimination of gambling. It is, however, about eliminating the harm of gambling, reducing it, and with that it is important to be very clear of the context of what means for community groups that the VAGF are working with or that our help-seeking support services are out there working with. I've seen the role that gambling plays in engaging our mob, where it has a role of a sense of freedom when they use the pokies or play bingo, and what it's given to our communities and their families through gatherings where historically these families, their family members were rejected from these facilities because of their Aboriginality. This is a question to consider in itself around historical context and what that means in impacting the behaviours or experiences of disadvantage of particular community groups. I'm not a health professional. I'm a teacher by trade. I've been on the Vic Health board for 13 years and I have the privilege of being on the board of the VIGF. I've actively worked to look at ways we can build greater collaboration and consider what are critical aspects of the way in which sectors and industries engage and work to create social impact for Aboriginal communities. And when we do that, we affect the health and wellbeing of all community members for the better. I do want to acknowledge the work of our ACCHOs, the Aboriginal Community-Controlled Health Organisations, Aboriginal leaders and Aboriginal organisations who continue to keep the needs of Aboriginal people at the core of their work. This is often a challenge when there is constant pressure to validate the work that we are doing by multiple reports, multiple administration points that are often set up around delivering services within our communities. I also want to acknowledge that the non-Aboriginal people that have been there as leaders and have worked with us and listened deeply. Not only have they listened deeply, but they've worked with us to change what needs to change and make sustainable impact. We need to continue this approach, and we need to immobilise any sense of apathy that leaves us comfortable with the disparities with any community group, not only Aboriginal people. I was asked the question, so why is parity difficult to achieve? Well, Victoria is a unique state. We are less than 2% of the population, and the impact of colonisation has not been eliminated, given the perceived awareness from non-Aboriginal people and what they have of our communities, and the prejudice that Aboriginal Victorians experience through racism, exclusion, or inherited understanding of what an Aboriginal person is, or a real Aborigine. This state still experiences some of the highest disadvantages and life experiences compared to other Victorians, and it continues to be reflected in a number of young children we have in foster care, exceeding the numbers of that in which were taken through the stolen generation, which continues to have generational trauma impacting on our communities through a range of health issues, and gambling is one. In addition, our Aboriginal single mothers are identified. You know what? No matter how much I try and keep a cap on it, I really care about this stuff. And to hear that our mothers are the most disadvantaged and cannot get employment, and they're the most economically disadvantaged, and the risks that they carry just because they're a single black mother. You know, recent research shows us that they're at the bottom of the rung. We cannot remain comfortable knowing this. I've lost my place. Sorry. Look, these moments or statistics of disadvantage are the things that we as Aboriginal people don't want to talk about. It's a pulse check for the state, but we want to talk about what's special about us, about our resilience, about our strengths, and the possibilities for us to keep thriving. There's something right in our intelligence that has meant we have exceeded 65,000+ years as the oldest living cultures in the world. We haven't achieved parity for all the reasons that have been evidenced by the voice of Aboriginal Australians. Many reports, Aboriginal advocacy, statements like the Redfern Statement, the Statement from the Heart, and any sustainable change has been shown, is shown when it is Aboriginal-led. Our state has been gifted with the leadership and healthy agitation for change for generations, from an Aboriginal perspective, and now I'm proud to say as well, from a non-Aboriginal perspective, in advocating around a treaty or treaties relationship with us as First Peoples. I'm really proud of this, and so should all Victorians be. Should be extraordinarily proud of it. At Cultures Life, in my day job, we back Aboriginal-led initiatives which ensure our young people are engaged in programming that is Aboriginal community-led. For sustainability, this is a foundation stone, and it is fundamental to success in this field. So how does this relate to gambling? Well, we, at the foundation and with our partners, we need to invest in the advice, recommendations and knowledge of our people, and be unwavering on our approach to this regardless of the government of the day. The role of the Foundation and agencies like us, or working with us, must be willing to take the journey with Aboriginal communities across Victoria. Ensure a self-determined approach is taken to our work and be committed to the long game. All of the evidence shows that sustainable change occurs when Aboriginal people lead it. This is why the treaty discussion is so important in the state, and the potential of influencing historical change through a mechanism which provides Aboriginal peoples the choice to govern their own affairs. We at the Foundation, in our work, must be responsive to Aboriginal knowledge and advice, actively implementing our RAP, our Reconciliation Action Plan, which I'm really proud to say that with the representatives in our partnerships and through Louise's leadership, being able to, in the process of launching our first RAP, and we'll model the change internally together with our partner agencies. We'll invest in Aboriginal-led solutions to influence change, take responsibility to lead the change in our work, and commit to building awareness and competency in a way in which we conduct our own business. It sounds like an organisation willing to take responsibility. Where we have the traditional approaches to assessing or the learnt generational belief that the problems only exist with Aboriginal people, we must consider the holistic approach to wellbeing and the health and wellbeing of our mob. Be inclusive of the cultural, social, emotional and economic wellbeing alongside the historical context in which all members of Victorian communities share. This shared history brings trauma and generationally impacts our health and wellbeing. And as a collective, we must address this in a holistic manner. We must be across trauma-informed care and be trained in it, be guided in our communities and take our rightful responsibility in reframing and decolonising the impact of our shared history in the way in which we approach our work, knowing that it is collectively beneficial for us all. Now, I'm going to talk to my work at Culture is Life and the Foundation partnership we have for those mad keen football fans out there, and no doubt there's some Tiger fans in the audience. Yeah, well, there we go. Thank you very much. I've already talked about backing Aboriginal-led solutions to prevent youth suicide, and we work with our cultural entrepreneurs, and it's founded on trusting and knowing that they know their work best. We have the shared values, and we're really, really focused on shaping the experiences of our young people and their communities to, in essence, culturally bulletproof them where we can. Some of our most effective work, however, is with our strong collaborations that are in it for the long game. And I do mention the Richmond Football Club, and who I was privileged enough to work with for 6 years as an executive to build the Kurrangamaji Institute. Now, this ensures in our partnership that the management is Aboriginal-led and the leadership and decision-making of programming is done by Aboriginal people. This is the commitment of a club and the first national sporting organisation to hold an Elevate status RAP. The club has joined us in campaigning to reframe the relationship that the broader Australian community has with Aboriginal people. Our campaigns challenge mindsets through reflection and celebrate our strengths, talents and the knowledge of our mob. With the Premiership Club having over 95,000 members, we have an opportunity to engage and build the connections of non-Aboriginal Australians to the story and the cultural lineage of this country. This will counter, it will challenge, it will reset the learnt racism and discrimination, the unconscious bias and naivety that has been experienced by Aboriginal communities across the country. The likes of ATSIS PEP report, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Evaluation Project report, and many others, continue to show the complexity of this space. It is not simple. but a holistic engagement around the issues, and particularly of self-harm, family harm and community harm, gambling harm. There is the shared history and foundation of causal factors contributing to these behaviours. So, let's consider our roles and ensure that Aboriginal people and other vulnerable groups are at the centre of the conversations and guiding the collective response to work in all areas of health and wellbeing, and may we be a part of making, social impact that is sustainable, and that this pace doesn't grow, it actually grows in a different way. Thanks. So I've wanted to just put it out to the audience if there was any questions or comments, or again extend the invitation to the voice of our First Peoples in the room to jump in and add to what I might have offered in the discussion. No shame in here. Up the back. Hi.
Oh no, I don't need that on loud enough. Good. Everyone can hear me. I know it's been said like that 65,000 years, but last year the Cambridge University actually have genetic research that our culture is actually 85 to 95,000 years old, and their estimates on other artefacts is actually from 100 to 125,000 years old.
Thanks, sis. I mean, we know that. We know there's a figure that is, absolutely. But I love that a very traditional Cambridge University had to do the assessment to tell us that. So, but really, really important point. And I guess, I feel such pride knowing that. And why is our country not more alive about celebrating and exploring that and announcing and, really embracing that story? I often talk about, for the Māori people in the room or the Kiwis in the room, I'd say we had a young Māori player, and I'd say, lo and behold, Dustin. So, brother boy, when you see the haka, do you just see Maori mob doing it? No, Belinda would. I don't. I said, well, can you tell who's Maori and who's not? No. The absorption and integration of their cultural connection to their place and their belonging and their ancestral story supersedes everything. And there is something extraordinarily inspiring about that, and I hope that I live a lifetime where I get to see it. I'll be one of the old aunties sort of banging on in the background here, and we got there, we got there. With my false teeth jiggling in the background, no doubt. No, hopefully by then I'll just have my, implants. Anyway. Sorry, other questions? Please, I really would welcome them. This is an opportunity to really open up dialogue that isn't often spoken about. So, Louise.
Just terrific to hear you speak so personally, but to make it sort of so political and, in a way, really interested in any thoughts you have on how we, as you put it, immobilise the apathy. Because I think gambling harm is something that there isn't still a lot of knowledge about. And I appreciate the way you talked about, gambling continues, but we're interested in the gambling harm aspect here. And how do we sort of immobilise the apathy around this, in your view?
I think I'm thinking of the sites and the Aboriginal community sites that we're currently working with, and there's such honesty and integrity and stay the course with those sites. And they're working, there's nothing more, there's no one more experienced than the people on the ground that know their sites. As a state, just like any community across the state of Victoria, there is inherent relationships, some of which are extraordinarily cohesive and some of which are not. And in leadership roles, it's our responsibilities to get the decision makers to the table and challenge them on the way in which they are working to a certain agenda. And the gambling space is something that we will continue to work with to explore that. Apathy is an interesting one because the moment you ask emotive questions, there's a shift in the energy. When there's an intellectual level to what you do, it seems to be much more comfortable to process. But when there's a deep emotional or psychological challenge on the work in which you do with community groups, being uncomfortable is what we need to pursue. To have courageous conversations, yeah. And the shame in gambling, I just don't feel like we as a foundation have even touched the scope of people that are living and experiencing this day to day. I really don't feel like the psyche of our communities broadly have allowed themselves to truly recognise the cost and harm from gambling. Because sometimes you don't realise it's happening till after the fact. It's a domestic violence situation. Sometimes you don't realise it until people have removed themselves from an experience and what that occurs. But to go back to the responsibility, it has to be front and centre in the way organisations work. They must make the commitment to be responsible and not put it at a policy level or a statement level and not enact it behaviourally on the ground. That's my biggest fear. And I guess it's for any agenda of social impact, is that really strong and bold statements can be made which are critical at that level, but how does that actually mobilise down on the ground? And what I love about our mob is if you're in there and they're talking to you, it's actually, you mightn't actually want to hear what they're saying because it might make you uncomfortable. But the fact that they're talking to you is that they trust you're going to do something about it. It's when people completely withdraw from relationships that they are going, we're not even going to waste our energy here anymore because these people are not in for the journey. It has to be a long game. Any other comments?
I just, part of the sort of Brendan's story and then the Aboriginal story, I was up in Far North Queensland with some of the mob last, is this loud enough?
It's just for others, maybe.
Sorry. And it was how much of the research is really acknowledging the legacy of colonisation in the story of some of the elders up there were saying that they're, a bit like Brendan was saying, it was all associated with some food for the family or playing cards, and it was very much associated with a really nice family event and community. So I'm just wondering how much is that really seen that it was a colonisation that was impacting on getting ahead. So if you didn't feel like you had a choice, you take a chance. So that kind of, I just want to know how much in the conversation it's acknowledged that this is not a recent thing, that harm that's kind of...
That's right.
Generations of...
Yeah. And that's why we need to continue the conversations with more Aboriginal voices at the table, and particularly the voices here from this state, living, breathing, that have been raised on this country. You know, there's a ridiculous percentage of people that are living off country. When I say off country, off their traditional lands, and so they're not only displaced as Aboriginal people, but they're displaced from their traditional homelands as well. It's double layered. I'm not a psychologist, but I am somebody that is so aware of how our families relate and connect and care deeply. We care so deeply that sometimes the comfort in accepting behaviours that are trauma-related means that we don't necessarily always seek the help we need to when we should be. It's our strength and it's our weakness, like a lot of communities. So, but again, I want to say there's great work happening on a whole range of communities. I think of Rumba and the stoic, just consistent leadership up that way. Hey, and I remember Uncle Paul talking to me about some of the things like street names that just racist. A signpost that was a racist street name, and yet because there was the generations of acceptance of it, and then having to advocate to change it, how that changes the psyche of a particular site's interesting, But I could talk about this space until I can't utter another word because I care so deeply about it, and I guess what we are committed to is addressing how those ceremonial activities have often been sites for gatherings and connecting, or when you go to carnivals, let's go down and drop a little bit at the pokies. And when it goes from, this is completely fine, we've all got a choice on how we actually utilise and share our incomes in a way in which is enjoyable, but at the cost of where it takes the next step around gambling harm is the issue that, it is just another form of a way in which it affects our communities. Aboriginal people in the audience, please, again, take this opportunity to say or comment or offer. Gone all quiet. Sorry, up the back.
I want to commend Victoria for leading the way when it comes to the public health approach. Across Australia, we're not doing enough in regards to the effective, I suppose, strategies for Aboriginal people. And I've been to every state working in many communities, and too often I've seen that not enough Aboriginal people are seeking assistance and support. 18% of research we undertook highlighted that Aboriginal people are problem gamblers, and they would impact 15 people around them. We're not seeing those numbers in counselling, but we're starting to grow, and many states now are starting to look at things outside of their therapeutic approach. So why aren't Aboriginal people in counselling? What can we do better as an intervention, as support? And we are doing more cultural stuff, I'm seeing. We're utilising more Aboriginal services, health services to help address problem gambling, but also, get that help. So, I wanted to commend Victoria. We run a statewide program in New South Wales, but what I've noticed is it's more... Victoria's leading the way in being fair income with their approach to supporting Aboriginal people. And I'm over the tokenistic, I'm over people saying that they support Aboriginal people, and on the ground that's not really happening. So for us, it's nice to see that you come down to Victoria, and even this morning you can see the large cultural component to a conference. So I commend you, and I look forward to the afternoon session.
Thank you, Ashley. Sorry, Julie.
Belinda, this is a very public way to ask you for some 360-degree feedback, but on behalf of the board of the foundation, what else can we do?
I guess as an Aboriginal...
Should we do?
Yeah, look, as an Aboriginal person that has sat on non-Aboriginal boards, we at Reconciliation Victoria currently looking at ways in which we ensure that Aboriginal perspectives are informing our decision making. We have such a cultural load from our council members that constantly they're pushed to be present a whole range of activities. And I guess why I talk about Reconciliation Victoria, very minimal funding, big hearts, big commitment, but they're really trying to explore ways to ensure that the Aboriginal guidance is, because we will never be an Aboriginal organisation because it's a reconciliation agenda. We've got both balance, but that informs the way in which we work. And looking at what we are exploring as a knowledge council, which values Aboriginal knowledge and the way and the forms in which that is expressed that mightn't be the traditional governance qualification. I think we're on the journey. We've started with our RAP. We're working to engage with the people on the ground that know this work in their communities. We've got to continue to do that, and we've got to put our milestones in place as indicators of measures of success, and let that be advised from Aboriginal communities. Let that third-party advocacy keep us accountable. You know, it's important to have diversity around our board, and I think we do that, but diversity of knowledge and the diversity of Aboriginal community needs varies from whether you're down at Gunditjmara country or up at Yorta Yorta country or, you know, Western District. But to ensure that we hold, number one, the relationships as critical focus areas for communities, because without our relationships, it's not going to be sustainable. And if I be honest, I fear that, you know, my biggest fear historically has been that hasn't always been, not from the Foundation's perspective, but in other roles, that isn't front and centre and core to the way in which we do business. It's seen as an extra burden, versus fundamentally, if we about changing the experiences of harm, and for me self-harm and suicide, or changing the life experiences of those most vulnerable, we need to absolutely be so intensely focused on thinking differently about the way in which we do business, the way in which we engage and relate on contracts. And I think about the work of Vic Health and the relationship building that was done with communities to be responsive to the needs and pressures that are happening on the ground. Our RAP gives us that public accountability, but being courageous and bold is something that needs to be discussed in a unified way from you know, Aboriginal perspective and non-Aboriginal perspective. Okay, I'm getting the wind up. Thank you so much for listening to me, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, Tony.